You to take your seats, first of all. Thank you very much. This is my honor to be here today with you because I think that the report we are launching today and discussing on is extremely important because of only one reason, a reason in which I strongly believe. I do believe that the human, the people, are in the core of whole European idea. And when we talk about the people with disadvantages, the people which have need of help, these are the people who should be in the core of our European policy. So I'm very glad to see this full audience today here, and I'm very glad to see our colleagues in the panel. Extremely glad that some of them are from Bulgaria, which is my country. I'll mention a few words about Bulgaria, of course. But anyway, it is an honor, and I'm glad to welcome you at the launching event of the report dedicated to the role of the European Structural and Investment Funds for the transition from institutional to community-based living for children and young people, older persons, including all those with disabilities. In order to promote social inclusion of people, countries must move away from the institutional model of care towards a system of community-based care and support. The transition process is complex to manage the politically sensitive. The structural and investment funds for 2014-2020 have given possibilities for member states to support more effective and efficient social protection systems. Investment in the transition to community-based services is an investment in human potential and social inclusion. The European semester and set-up ex-ante conditionalities also provide opportunities for structured policy monitoring on this issue. The European Structural and Investment Funds support a wide range of measures in line with the requirement to the poverty reduction policy framework. This is thematic objective 9 in the structural policy, in order to prevent institutionalization and support the reforms for the transition. The measures proposed are part of the strategic vision on how the transition from institutional to the community-based care will be implemented in line with the criteria under the proposed ex-ante conditionalities for active inclusion. I come from Bulgaria, as I mentioned, and I would like to give you a very positive example from my country. I'm proud of which. Since 2009, my country has been implementing an ambitious and extensive deinstitutionalization reform, on one side strategically based, and on the other side successfully managing the combination and complementarities of 3 European Union funds: the European Regional Development Fund, European Social Fund, and the European Agricultural Fund for the Rural Development. And this is one of the main messages I'm trying to pass you today. It is extremely important to use the combination between the different funds, not to focus all the attention on the fund for the social cohesion, because the social fund is absolutely important and needed, but it could be complemented by the Fund for Regional Development, by the Fund for Rural Development, by even from some of the other funds I mean the new financial instruments of the Union, like Fund for Strategic Investment. If in the future we can combine all these opportunities to be used and focus them to be used for the purposes we discussed today, this new model of taking care for these people, we can achieve more success. Using only one instrument, we use the one instrument. Using all the instruments, we have better success for the future. And I think this is extremely important. And I have to say this is the best example from Bulgaria, because our experience shows that the combination between the funds is possible. It was difficult to combine the efforts of different administrations. It was difficult to combine the efforts of administration, national administration, and non-governmental sectors, social partners. It was difficult to involve the people working in the system of the care. But it works when the purpose is clear, when the goal is clear, and when we have a good result in each one of the steps we go on. Of course, we have to go further. Of course, we have not completed yet the whole process, and I don't think it is possible to be completed. But I think the development were targeted to finance a joint combined project for improving the life of the children with disabilities, especially for the children with disabilities in Bulgaria, and for creating a model for transformation of the child care institutions into alternative community-based services. During the current programming period, Bulgaria continues the process of deinstitutionalization through European Regional Development Fund and European Social Fund, with the aim to provide alternative options to institutional care through the development of accessible and high-quality community-based services, and conclude this process entirely until 2025. This is our national ambition. In the report, it is pointed out that Bulgaria implements the right approach with the development of new quality standards of the appropriate community-based social services, and the country implements also the partnership principle through the involvement of the civil community into the process using its expertise. Being a chair of the Committee on Regional Development in the European Parliament, I would like to highlight the importance of ensuring further coherence and consistency across all European Union funding instruments, so that they are used only to contribute to the transition to family and community-based living. The complementarity and synergies between different European Union funds and instruments, the further simplification of such combination is also very important for the efficient and effective implementation of the institutionalization process across Europe. And one last remark. I would like to underline that it is very important to explain, to tell the story about the successes we have. We have to communicate with the European citizens. We have to make our achievements visible. We have to introduce the goals and the purposes and the results, because I know that when the European citizens are enough well informed, they will appreciate what we have done. And this is a very important message, communication and visibility, because we are thinking for the future and we need the support from the European citizens. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be today with you and to open this very important and useful conference. Thank you.
Dobrý den, jmenuji se Martina Kubátová a je mi 19 let. Něco přes 16 let žiji ve 12členné milující rodině. Pocházím z romského geta, ráda se věnuju hudbě, četbě a sportu.
Good evening. My name is Martina Kubátová. I am 19 years old, and for over 16 years I have lived in a 12-member loving family. I come from the Roma ghetto. I like to play music, sport and reading.
Jak už jsem zmínila, žiji ve 12členné rodině. Moji rodiče mají v pěstounské péči 8 dětí. A to převážně děti, které by měly problém se dostat do rodiny. Tím je naše rodina pestrá. 2 děti mají biologické.
As I mentioned earlier, I belong to a 12-member family. My parents have 8 children in foster care, mostly children who have for different reasons problem going into the family. So this is why our family is varied. And my foster parents have also 2 of their own children.
Když mi byly necelé 3 roky, vzali si mě manželé Kubátovi z kojeneckého ústavu. Vybrali si mě, protože jsem kvůli barvě pleti a kvůli biologické rodině neměla šanci na umístění do rodiny.
I was in an institution for almost 3 years. When I was 3 years old, my foster parents took me from the baby home. They chose me because I did not have a chance to be placed in another family because of the color of my skin and because of my biological family.
Už jako malá jsem si představovala, jaké by to bylo, kdybych zůstala v dětském domově. Z každého hrozivého příběhu, která si moje fantazie vymyslela, plynuly tyto věci.
When I was a little child, I often imagined what it would be like if I stayed in a children's homes. I thought about horrible stories in my fantasy, and what I can say is that
nevěděla bych, co obnáší život v rodině. Mohla bych to jen sledovat z gauče na televizi ve společenské místnosti dětského domova.
I would not know family life. I could just watch it on the TV, on sofa, in the living room, in the children's home.
Neměla bych místo, kam se můžu vracet za jakéhokoliv počasí. Možná bych kvůli mateřské lásce, kterou bych nedostávala, nedokázala odpustit svým biologickým rodičům.
I would not have a place I can come back to in any weather. Maybe I could not forgive my biological parents because the maternal love from my foster mother helped me to forgive them.
Prostě bych neměla rodinu. Tátu, mámu, sourozence, kteří mě milují bezpodmínečně.
I just would not have a family. My father, mom and siblings who love me unconditionally.
Nemyslím si, že dětské domovy jsou špatné, ale ani si nemyslím, že by byly dobré. Každé dítě potřebuje dostat od rodičů na míru šité brnění, kované láskou pro boj s životem. Vím, že mít milující a funkční rodinu...
I don't think the children's homes are bad, but I don't think they are good. Every child needs to get love from parents. It is like a suit of armor that helps to protect them through life struggles.
Vím, že mít milující a funkční rodinu není samozřejmost, ačkoliv by měla být. Mít rodinu domov je víc, než patřit do nějaké sociální skupiny.
I know that to have a loving and functional family is not a matter of course, but it should be. Having a family and home is more important than being a member of some social group.
Investovat do práce s rodinou je důležité. Je důležité pomoci dětem a rodinám zůstat spolu, v případě najít dětem novou rodinu. Je to jako investovat do kovářství, kde se vyrábí brnění pro děti kované láskou.
I think it is very important to invest to families, to help children stay in their families or find them new family and help them to stay together. It is like investing in blacksmith where the armor for children is made with love.
Protože vím, že není možné mít normální rodinný život v dětském domově.
Because it's easy, I know that it's not possible to have a normal family in the children's home. Okay. Thank you very much.
Здравейте! Казвам се Михайла Иванова и работя като самозастъпник в Лумос.
Hello, my name is Mihaylova Ivanova and I work as a self-advocate in Lumos.
Всяко дете има право на семейство. Толкова е просто.
Every child has a right to a family. It's so simple.
Няма как дом в 100 деца да е семейство.
There is no way 100 children in one house can become a family.
В дом за 100 деца ти си никой. Присъстваш по документи, нямаш свобода, нямаш бъдещите да покажеш какво можеш. И зализаш
Не си подготвен. Искаш да ми това?
Не си нужен на никого, нито на себе си. Или тръгваш по лош път.
Where you live in a house with 100 children, you are nobody. You exist only in documents. There is no freedom to express your abilities. There is no future for you. You go wrong path. So you're useless for yourself, for others.
Ай, разбрах, че така се струваш скъпо на обществото.
And I realized you're also expensive for the society.
Аз съм била три години в институция. Сега живея със семейството си, работя като самозастъпник и мога да кажа каква подкрепа за мен е нужна и за моите връстници.
I was in an institution for 3 years. Now I live with my family. I am a self-advocate, and I could say what support my peers and I need.
Да завърша успешно училище, да мога да работя, но ме трябват реални знания, добро образование, като на другите хора.
To graduate successfully from school so I can work. But I need to receive real knowledge, good education as it is for other people.
Да посещавам центрове, където да научавам нови умения.
To attend training centers where I could develop new skills and new knowledge.
Да ме подкрепят хора, които знаят как и са запознати с моите индивидуални нужди и мечти, да подкрепят и семейството ми.
I need to be supported by people who are clear about my individual needs and dreams. My family to be supported as well.
Да се срещам, да се забавлявам с приятели, да има достъпни места за тях, ако са в количка.
To meet people, to have fun with friends at accessible places for them if they're in a wheelchair.
От дневни центрове, в които да общувам с връстниците си.
We need to have daycare centers where I could communicate with peers.
От работни места, които са създадени според моите възможности.
We need working places that are created to meet my abilities.
Ако мама иска да работи, да не се притеснява за мен, а да продължи да се развива като специалист.
If my mom wants to work, not to worry, but to feel comfortable and free to develop herself as a professional.
Ако парите се дават за това, няма да са нужни домовете.
If money is given for these needs, there will be no need for institutions to exist.
Сто деца заедно не са семейство, дори 20 не са. Благодаря.
100 kids together is not a family. Even 20 kids is not. Thank you.
Now we have to leave. We are leaving now, and the other panel will appear soon. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Jared Quinn, and thank you, Madam Mihaylova, for being present here. And that was symbolically important as well as very practically important for the next renegotiations of the regulations. Mairead McGuinness has already been here, and she will slip back in later on. My task is a very short and brief one, which is to explain to you some of the findings of the study, and to then hand over to Georgette, who's going to explain some of the recommendations that come from those findings. Allow me to make one or two preliminaries before I unzip the findings for you. And don't worry, I'll do it at a very general level. If you want the actual detail, the report is, I think, available for you to read on your flight home or instead of watching Netflix tonight or whatever. One or two preliminaries. I think it's really important to realize that the funds don't create obligations for states. States already have these obligations under international law. What the funds do is they provide a means by which the European taxpayer, out of solidarity, can assist the member states in achieving their obligations. I think it's quite important because sometimes it's framed as if the funds are getting in the way, they're placing side constraints on how we do our business. No, they're not. The funds are simply facilitating our member states to do the right thing and to do the thing they're actually obliged to do in the first instance. So I think true to the, and sorry for the lawyers' legalese here, the doctrine of additionality in the EU funds, they are actually doing exactly what they're supposed to do. So the ex-antes, to my mind, the social ex-antes, the things that give a social face to the European Union, are not in themselves opposing obligations. They're building on obligations all of our states already have, and they're creating genuine EU additionality, which is something to be proud of as European citizens. Second preliminary, I guess, is that the Union is often said to be founded on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. That's very true, but it's also rhetoric, and it only really is important in people's lives if the funds, if all of these ideas like human rights can reach into the sinews of power, and that principally is the financial instruments at the behest of the European Union. So it's kind of a test for how serious we take the founding of the Union on democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. The relevant ex-antes are intersectional. That's very beautiful. That's quite rare in comparative and international law to see an instrument that crosses boundaries, that crosses groups, and tries to connect them up. To me, at any level, this is really the very best of what the European Union is for. So, leaving those preliminaries to one side, the study really is a snapshot picture of the changes that have happened in the last 3 or 4 years after the landmark breakthrough with the addition of the social ex-ante conditionalities in 2013. It tries to set out an accurate and an accessible picture of what has worked, what maybe has not worked as well, why has it worked and why has it not worked, and can we, as it were, refine the regulations going forward. Where there is unevenness, and there is some unevenness, this is not beyond the wit of man to refine and to nudge along in the right direction, which is what we'll be encouraging. What did we find? And I'll really crunch it down to 4 things, although there is more, much more. First of all, just at the level of ideas, the funds have been highly instrumental in changing the goalposts, in changing the conversation, in changing the narrative. There's a new high ground, and states are gradually occupying that high ground, which they have to anyway because it's their international obligations under the Convention on the Rights of the Child as well as the UN Disability Treaty. And that is quite remarkable. Of course, occupying the high ground is only the beginning. Adopting strategies is only the beginning. Allowing that to percolate down to actual practices where the rubber hits the road and where it actually means differences in the lives of our ordinary citizens. There is a delay in doing that. That's kind of natural, but at least we've actually changed the conversation dramatically, and I would suggest there is no going back. So the first finding is really a finding about how the level playing field has switched sides, and we're really into a completely different conversation. I guess the second finding is that there's some outstanding examples of good practice. We could mention Bulgaria, and there are 2 or 3 others which are covered in the narrative in the report. Where these good practices take root, it's usually because the member state has internalized the value system and the vision of the strategic fund, the regulations of the structural funds. And when they decide to cleverly use all of the funds, not just the ESIF, but also the agricultural, rural development funds and so forth, a very intentional, clever strategy to optimize the added value of the European Union in pushing forward a domestic, and it has to be a domestic, agenda of change. And once they do that, they can take very significant steps, or sometimes even just baby steps, but you know they're headed in the right direction. And we cover that in the report, and that's for you to read at your leisure. I think the important thing is not what Bulgaria does, not what Germany does, not what Ireland does, but when we have good examples, it shows that everybody can actually move forward and do something very constructive. I think we did find some unevenness, which is kind of to be expected. This is first time out of the box. This is a profound culture shift. It's almost predictable that it's going to take a few more efforts to steady the ship and put it pointed in the right direction. So, for example, we found a discernible trend away from institutionalization toward what we call trans-institutionalization. That means moving from large institutions to somewhat smaller institutions. And I'd say a few things on this. Some, perhaps from some member states, not all, certainly not all member states, would say, hey, that's progressive achievement. We've moved from 100 to 30. Aren't we great? Hey, presto, community living is assured. I doubt that, and our team doubt that. Why? Well, partly I come from a university. I've seen temporary buildings go up and remain for 30 or 40 years, and there is absolutely no guarantee that a way station like 20 or 30 or even 5 will change into the future. 30 years is 2 generations already, and that's too much. You might say it could form progressive realization if there was a plan to move down to 2 over a very strict timeline with dedicated and ring-fenced resources, with milestones that third parties can independently monitor and evaluate. But we have seen very little of this in those instances where there has been trans-institutionalization as distinct from deinstitutionalization. And in any event, our team would be very insistent that a smaller institution is still an institution and is not necessarily something to be proud of. Let me just say one very quick word about numbers, whether it's 100 or 50 or 30 or 10 or 5 or 2. It's not just about numbers. One of the things we deliberately put into the UN Disability Treaty was an article on awareness raising. The reality is, if the man or the woman on the street passes by a mini institution with 5 people, all they will see is the common denominator that connects the people, which is in fact just the disability. There will be no incentive to look beyond that congregated identity to actually view the person and welcome the person into the community. We've also seen interesting unevenness in terms of medium-sized institutions being renovated using other arms of the structural funds, for example, to achieve energy efficiency. Now, this is clever. This is what lawyers do. They look for loopholes and they try to find ways of continuing doing what they've done in the past. We've got to find some way in the next iteration of the regulations to center the social aspect of deinstitutionalization so that when there are countervailing thrusts in the regulations, they're put back in their place and we resume a sense of the priority of deinstitutionalization. One more thing. We've also seen the renovation. We've also seen a focus on numbers as the key metric for advancement and change. We haven't seen an equal and insistent focus on, let's say, measures in terms of personal outcomes. I don't like that terminology myself because you can't measure a person in terms of outcomes. You measure them not in terms of the good life, but their own lives, the lives they want to pursue and so forth. It's not beyond the wit of man to develop these kind of measurements according to which we can genuinely assess whether or not we're moving in the right direction. So let me conclude and hand over to Georgette with just 2 points. Our main concern today, and especially next year when the regulations are up for renewal, are the regulations. But I think it's worthwhile reflecting that over the past 4 years or so, 3-4 years, what we call the ecosystem that surrounds the regulations, the production of knowledge, the production of really useful guidance to member states has ramped up very significantly. And I would say Exhibit A there is the recent EU FRA report, not lecturing and hectoring states, but talking about modalities of budgeting, how you actually move budgets from institutions into community-based settings. And indeed, there are projects now being funded by Horizon 2020, et cetera, and of course we have the European Expert Group. So we're surrounding the formal regulations with real knowledge and tools. I'm tempted to say there's no longer an excuse. I don't like that language myself, but you get the point, that the ecosystem has now evolved to the stage that is highly realistic for states to learn from each other and begin using the funds properly and appropriately. Second concluding point I would make is that when we widen the lens beyond Europe, we realize that the arc of travel of the structural funds is perfectly mainstream. For example, when you look at the US administration on community living, which works intersectionally, and when you look at how it's trying to draw together the disparate strands of federal funding and apply them like a laser beam to assisting their states to achieve the transition to community living, you realize that really we're of a part with a much bigger story that's taking root right around the world. I'd love to see a meeting of minds between the federal agency and what we're doing on the structural funds, but that, I guess, is something for next year. So that's my quick whistle-stop tour of the findings, which you can read at your own leisure, and I now hand you over to Georgette.
Thanks so much, Jared. Yeah. It's a real honour to be here, and it's great to see everybody. And I have to say personally, to confess personally, that if my activist self 25 years ago had known that I would get excited and enthusiastic about European funding regulations, I think she would have suggested I should be stood up against a wall and shot. That said, what Jared pointed out so eloquently was that these regulations are causing a massive shift, a seismic shift. And of course, because of that, it has been a bit of a shaky start, although there are lots and lots of positives to be seen. We've seen, I'm sure we've all seen experience in countries where initially governments are dragged kicking and screaming to do something, either by civil society or by an external force like the EU, or a combination or whatever, but that actually what they end up doing is that they kind of go, oh God, all right, then we'll do this. And then they suddenly start to see the benefit and the penny drops. We're in the very, very early stages at the moment of that process. And I'm quite confident, quietly confident, that by the end of this first programming period of these regulations, we will be at a stage where the penny has dropped for most of the governments that are in receipt of the structural funds, and that they will actually be actively saying, oh, actually, this was quite a good idea, and they'll be ready to move forward with alacrity and with enthusiasm. For that to happen, it's going to be really important that we ensure, all of us together, that we maintain the criteria around the transition from institutional to community-based approaches that is currently in ex-ante conditionality 9.1, that in the next programming period we make sure it's still there. So we've got a lot of work to do now, all together, to demonstrate the benefit, along with the challenges, of the changes that are taking place, but also for everybody to recognise that massive transformations of systems, that's a long-term project. And so it's going to need the regulations, the next programming period's regulations, to continue to uphold this and enforce it. We also feel very strongly, and we're working with quite a few other organisations that work on outside the European Union member states, that whatever we think is appropriate for EU citizens is also appropriate for everybody throughout the world. So if it's not good enough for us to put our own children or older people or people with disabilities into an institution, it's not good enough anywhere. And so therefore, anywhere the EU is spending its money, our money, as taxpayers, as a proud European, in spite of the accent, that everywhere we're spending that money. So the humanitarian aid, the development funding should also ensure that there is no investment in institutions and that there is a prioritisation of the development of systems and supports that make it possible for everybody to live in the community, for children to live in families. There's a lot of recommendations, so I'm just going to pull out a few. They are in the report, and I would recommend, if you're struggling to sleep at night, you can pick it up. Just joking. Actually, there's some really good stuff in here. I was checking whether everybody was actually still awake. Clearly, what has happened is that some of the member states are really taking the ball and running with it. They've really understood, and the guidance that has been developed and the training programmes have had an impact. Others, not so much. The other thing that we have to remember is that administrations change. And every time an administration changes, and this is kind of something politicians do the world over from my experience, they like to say that everything the last government did was rubbish and they did it all wrong, and so we're going to do something new entirely. As we said, transforming systems takes a long time. Building social movements takes a long time. It's never going to be done in one administration. So what we have to do is find ways to keep working together, to keep raising awareness, to keep providing training and more guidance and more training to all the new administrations that come along. And if there are countries that, clearly are struggling to go down the right road, then we need to really put as much as we possibly can into those countries to support them to move in the right direction. We need to make sure that the plans that member states are putting in place, so the European Commission needs to ensure that the plans put in place by member states are based on a thorough evidence and needs analysis at the country level. There can be a tendency, and it's understandable, there are massive programmes and massive amounts of money that governments and managing authorities have to allocate. There can be a tendency to kind of go, we're roughly going to do this, so that we can get the funding allocated. And that means that sometimes the systems and the services that are being put in place do not actually match the real need on the ground. And there is a risk also there that we spend money and we invest money where it's not necessary, instead of investing it in the right places. And Martina, thank you so much for talking about investing in families. We need to see this as investing in people. And I think for DG Regio, that's challenging because the money there is for infrastructure. And what can tend to happen, as Gerard was saying about the trans-institutionalisation, sometimes this is a little bit about a lack of vision and a lack of imagination. We've got these big institutions. We know they're not a good idea. Let's do some small ones, We've got some infrastructure money. Let's invest in some small institutions. Instead of thinking about what Mihaylova was telling us earlier, how do we make all schools and colleges completely accessible and inclusive of all children and young people who need education? How do we invest in hospitals and clinics and community-based services so that they're fully inclusive and accessible to all families and all people who need them? How do we use infrastructure to build communities rather than thinking about how do we move from a big institution to a smaller one? And that means that that infrastructure money really will be investing in people. Monitoring. clearly there is, again, when you're doing massive change, it's difficult to get away from numbers. You know, so people do look at, and it is a measure of success. Have we reduced the number of children in institutions by 75% in Bulgaria? Yes, we have. But if that was the only measure of success, well, you know, how many of them are dead? Do you know what I mean? You could ask that question. Actually, in Bulgaria, there's also been a very significant reduction in mortality rates because there was very high mortality in the institutions. So there's lots of different measures that we need to be looking at. Quality of life. How does the person feel? Are they happy? Are they included? Do they feel part of their society? Do they feel valued? Again, hearing Mihaylova say that in an institution she felt like she was useless. She felt like she was useless to herself and useless to society, and that she only existed in documents. So we need measures that are really saying, how does somebody feel about the life that they are leading? And I think the final one that I would just come in on is other EU funds. And again, this was mentioned earlier by our esteemed Member of Parliament as well as by Gerard. So there are other funds. There's the Rural Development Fund, but there's also the European Fund for Strategic Investments, the Structural Reform Support Programme. It's challenging to ensure that all of these funds align, but it's really important to do that. Finally, on this one, civil society. I think it's interesting that from my experience, and this isn't in the report, so this is what I'm saying personally, so the authors are not responsible for this point, the countries where they're struggling to really transform systems of care tend to have a less democratic and more authoritarian approach generally. And these are the countries that are also shutting civil society out of the debate and out of the involvement in the process of change. So a litmus test for democracy is actually what, you know, how many of our citizens do we lock up who've committed no offence? Another litmus test is how prepared is government to be held to account by civil society, and how safe does civil society feel in being able to hold government to account. So we need to, again, and this is again the place where the funds can be very, very helpful as a lever, to really pressure member states to fulfil their obligations under the regulations, to genuinely involve civil society as fully as possible in the transformation of our services across Europe. And one final recommendation I would make to anybody who is involved in a decision-making process around the change of a system is simply to ask yourself, would I want to live there? Would I want my child to live there? Would I want my mother to live there, or my brother, or my sister? And if the answer is no, we really shouldn't be doing it. So thank you ever so much to everybody who's contributed. This is a real team effort to get this report together, and I hope it will be of value. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to ask the next panel to come and join me, if that's okay. And I am going to really keep us all as short as we possibly can. I'm sure we can run it past 12:30 a little bit because we didn't get in here for 15 minutes, but we'll be being pressured to leave. So we're going to keep it as tight as possible because I'd love there to be an opportunity for discussion as well. So panellists, please come and join me. So without further ado, let's move straight into it. Thank you very much, panellists, for joining me. As I said, I am going to keep you all maximum 5 minutes, okay, each of you. So I would like to introduce, and I hope I pronounce this correctly, Milan Švežepa. Yeah? Okay, not far off. Not far off. Okay. Who is the co-chair of the European Expert Group on the transition from institutional to community-based care. I think everybody here knows about the work of the EEG, and I know that it has been instrumental in helping to get these regulations through and in helping to push them into practice. So, Milan, please.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, the organizers, for having me. Georgette, you actually did one of the best job in pronouncing my surname since I arrived here in Brussels, so thank you very much. It was pretty impressive. I'd like to make a couple of points on following what was said here already on the report. They will, of course, focus on the ex-ante conditionality and how it should be extended and what else should be done to promote the cause of ending segregation and integrating people back into communities. First point would be on the ex-ante conditionality itself. And I would say, personally, I'm amazed that it should even be discussed whether to keep it. I suppose that this would be the basic requirement, and this wouldn't be under any discussion at all. So, to the second point then, I think the focus of the following discussion in the upcoming financial frameworks negotiations should be how do we extend the ex-ante conditionality, both in geographical scope and also how do we extend it in applying to all the other relevant financial mechanisms. And it also be the focus of that discussion, what other measures and incentives do we apply to the funding to promote a truly systemic change in member states. Because it is not only about preventing the use of European money to refurbish or build new institutions. The focus should be mainly, or that would be the minimum as the ex-ante conditionality. The focus should be mainly how do we ensure a truly systemic change in how the services are provided and how people are supported so they don't end up in institutions. And so, if they already live there, as over 1 million Europeans do, so they can early and safely transition and be integrated back into community. That should be the focus on in the next discussions on the financial mechanisms. What incentives can we apply so the member states really use the opportunities of the EU funding, and it's not left just to do a couple of things here and there, and then just to continue with the national funding as if nothing happens, to continue to invest all the national money still in institutions and the old-fashioned provision of services. The third point would be we also should talk a lot more about how to incentivize and how to put more pressure in here on member states and on all the responsible authorities to really involve those who are directly affected by institutionalization in planning, in implementing, in making any decisions that are truly relevant to their lives. And that applies not only to those who are surviving in institutions, but also to those who are not living in institutions but are living in dread of ending up in an institution, be that people with disabilities or children, or be that also their family members. They need to be properly involved in making any relevant decisions. We hear a lot about the need for examples, experience, research, evidence. I think we are well past the point where we need more of this. There is enough research and evidence. There is not enough action. And on behalf of the EEG, of course, we are here to support the action. We are here to support the action by facilitating exchange of practices and of knowledge, how to implement the existing evidence and the existing knowledge in many countries. We are here to help by, for example, providing trainings either at EU level or at national level, or facilitating the exchange of ideas, of examples. But the focus and true focus of everything that we should be doing in the coming months is really to make sure, as the EU says it wants with its money, to make a real difference and to achieve a truly European added value. And just saying that we don't want to see more investment in existing institutions is no longer enough. We must see more action on actually supporting people and leaving those institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you so much for sticking to time. It is much appreciated. Now, I'm not going to do big introductions because I don't want to take people's time. So I'm going to just hand over to Zara Todd from the European Network on Independent Living.
My question is, what Europe do we want? Because actually, structural funds and structure and infrastructure are the base of what Europe we want. And without the proper infrastructure, disabled people can never be fully included. And I think that's the basis from which we start to look at how structural funds are used. Because actually, structural funds across Europe are about creating the infrastructure to achieve European values, whoever you are. And at the moment, European structural funds, they exist, people use them, but we don't think about how they're being used before we give the money. Yes, they're looked at, but actually, at the moment, our structures are predominantly focused on identifying problems when they arise, rather than thinking about, actually, what is our vision? Where do we want to go? What are our values as a European society? So we need to be moving from, yes, we need to be monitoring, definitely, but we need to be thinking about where are we going in the process? At what point are we actively engaging with civil society organisations, with people that are being directly affected by how these funds are used? ENIL is a disabled people's organisation. We are a grassroots organisation. We have individual and organisational members in all of the European Union states. What is fascinating and frustrating and also interesting is that in most of our countries, disabled people's organisations do not have the capacity to be engaging with the structures that enable monitoring of European structural funds. They do not have the technical knowledge to wade through the paperwork and the processes that exist to hold structural fund spending to account. At ENIL, we have a EU Funds for Our Rights campaign, and we have been working with our membership to highlight where structural funds are not being used correctly. But one of the things that we've experienced as an organisation is that often disabled people's organisations need extra support, and they get it from ENIL and from other organisations, to actually be able to engage in what is quite a technical and lengthy process. For us, there is massive benefit from the conditionality 9.1. And the idea that that might be at risk is frankly terrifying, because for me, that conditionality is not just about disabled people, but actually about how we look at society in general. That is about creating inclusive and cohesive communities, which is incredibly important when we're looking at independent living. As numerous of the speakers have said before me, and I particularly appreciate the interventions from the self-advocates, independent living is about having choice and control over your life, about being able to live as part of your community, as part of your family. We need to have infrastructures that support that to happen. One of the things that is particularly clear about the European structural funds is we need to have co-production throughout the entire process between civil society organisations and the desk officers, the commissioners, the MEPs, because actually we're all working together to make sure that this money is used in the best possible way. Nobody in this process wants money to be used in ways that don't meet the European goals. And I'm going to end by highlighting this is not just about what we see for Europe, but it's also about how Europe meets its obligations under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, particularly Article 19. The majority, and I apologise, Gerald, the majority of EU states have ratified the convention, and the European Union itself has ratified the convention. Therefore, everything that we do, everything that comes out of Europe, should be following the spirit of the convention. And that is why we need to make sure that structural funds also follow the spirit of the convention, both in how they are used, but also, and this is the key thing for me, how we involve disabled people and our organisations in how those funds are used. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zara. Very powerful, very clear, and I'm sure everybody agreed with every single word, so thank you very much. I'm going to hand over straight away to Maciej Kucharczyk of the Age Platform Europe. One of the great things about the work of the EEG, one of the great things about the ESIV regulations, and one of the great things about Structural Funds Watch, it's about all of the groups of people who are in institutions or at risk of institutionalisation. So please.
Hello, thank you very much, Georgette. First of all, congratulations for issuing this report and for actually coming with a step further in this common reflection, as you said, which encompass all different age and population groups. So we were absolutely very happy to be a part of this process and to be able also to highlight our concerns and points of view. Age as a member of, is the member of the steering group of the Community Living for Europe Structural Funds Watch. Therefore, we absolutely agree with the report's overall main message that community living is a right for everyone, including older people with care needs. Therefore, we as well support the objectives that European funds allow for the access of everyone to community living. When we look into the report, to be more specific, what are the other points of convergence between your findings and our position? Certainly, we consider that being integrated in the community is a precondition for everyone to live as equals and to be able to fully enjoy one's human rights. I think it's a starting point for all of us around here in this discussion. Whoever we represent, as I said, looking from the perspective of older persons, including those with needs for care, our, let's say, dimension and position might be a bit different, but all in all, we support the overall focus and the let's say, recommendations from the report. Another important element is about enjoying inclusive environments. Actually, social integration and community living can indeed very effectively prevent isolation and loneliness, in particular among persons with care needs. When we ask our members working at the grassroots level, indeed they report isolation and loneliness, and one of the key concerns for older persons, and here there is a link actually to the question on how apply the principle of community-based living and care for older people, because obviously the lack of access to quality care and support will hinder actually the ability to take fully part in the society. We were also very pleased to see some other important concern to be taken on board in your report, namely the emphasis on the need for a smooth transition towards community-based, in order to make sure that this process will not create any sort of care gaps. So actually when we look on one hand side, the needs that older persons heavily dependent will have, and on the other side, the availability of services. So certainly it was reported by some of our members, closing care homes in some countries, in some regions, led to some problems in terms of access to vital services for older persons. So again, this transition should be something very smooth and taking this dimension as well into the account. And then also, as the report very rightly states, that transition toward community-based should be also about opening up communities to create inclusive environments. Here as AGE, we've been, I know, absolutely, I've got as well my time. So we've been working here promoting age-friendly environments. We've got here a number of stakeholders around this discussion, so we are very happy to share this work. So having said this, before concluding, our views may, however, be more nuanced or differ in some aspects from what the report says. Age represents the interest of older people, including those with heavy dependence needs. Therefore, for us, for our members, the possibility of having a choice to live in their homes or in residential settlements is a matter of principle. This is the position that is based on our work across the EU with older people themselves. That's why we insist very much that this question of choice should, of course, include quality of services, enable community living, as well as social integration. Maybe last but not least, we believe that services available to older people should allow for community living with dignity, regardless of the living arrangement. Without going too much into detail, because my time is over, we know actually examples both of isolation, of abuse, of violence, both at home and in the residential settings, in the same way as we know as well successful actually transition and the quality services that are provided to persons with long-term care, as well in private settings, well at home, as well as in the residential settings. So to conclude, I would like again very much say and thank you for this report. We are open for further discussion. Unlike the disability movement, we are still in the process of actually coming to the, excuse me now, I'm totally annulé. Why is it? Yeah. So actually, unlike the disability movement, we are still actually in the process of having this reflection. We are building a shared understanding of how community-based living and services should be actually applied to older persons. That's why we are looking actually for the future cooperation with you and the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for that, Maciej, and it's really important that we all continue dialogue and working together on identifying the best solutions for all of us. And nuance always is important, and I think it's one of the things that simply doesn't exist in an institutionalized system is the idea of nuance and individual choice and individual rights. So without further ado, I'm going to move straight over to I think it's, oh, sorry, I'm getting the order wrong. Excuse me. To Yamen Gabriela Hrabanova, who is the director of the Ergo Network. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, and also congratulations for your report. It's a pleasure to also represent the Roma perspective at this panel. So I'm coming from the Ergo Network, which is a young dynamic network with members around the European Union, but also Balkan and Turkey. And we share our observation of the everyday Roma realities that is hardly taken into account in the policy development and implementation across Europe. At the European level, we are bringing the members' concerns. So this is also a very important moment to join the initiative of here, because we believe that the equality opportunities for now, especially young Roma, it's fair and just, and that it's also a smart economic choice. And that effective way to improve, and it's an effective way to improve the growth prospect and the respect to the demographic challenges of the rapidly aging population in our member states. And as Ergo, we concretely do the investment into young Roma. We also believe that it can help to break the cycle of poverty, discrimination, and inclusion. And investing in the institutionalization pays off the same way. It is the investment in our future generation, and your reports shows that. And we said that we see that majority of children in the institutions are of Romani origin. And as we heard from Mihaylova earlier today, it's also very hard to actually find their future placement in the new family because of their color of the skin. And they very rarely return to their biological families, and they often stay in the institutions. So these investments have very high returns, and we can deliver the kind of lasting change that we are looking for, that actually many policies so far are failing to achieve. Children and young people make nearly half of the today Roma communities in Europe. It's about 35.7% of our Roma people, it's under the age of 15. While in comparing to the majority of society, it's 15.7%. So it's almost double than the majority of population children. And to stress one more time again, Romani children are overrepresented in institutional care compared to their proportion in the population as a whole. There are many factors contributing to it: discrimination, poverty, material conditions such as unemployment. We have a huge indebtedness, and we have also inadequate housing. We call it an Ergo network, and we call the root cause anti-Gypsyism. It's really a kind of specific form of racism towards Roma. But we also see that the preventive measures are often inadequate, that there are insufficient number of social workers, mediators, and a total absence of investment in the community development due to the lack of funding or maltargeting. So Romani children are disadvantaged on the multiple ground, and to make it short, we really need to invest into integrated approach. So the integrated approach, which would combine that will combine to fight the social inclusion, but also to the root cause of the exclusion, which we say anti-Gypsyism. So we need, for example, intensive trainings for the staff of social institutions, social workers, teachers, school administration, in all the new types of services and approaches to the Roma communities. In Ergo Network, we are exploring these useful and promises measures. We are very much focusing on the employment measures because this is kind of a bridging, to kind of contribution to the society. And we are also investing in the fact-finding to map those barriers and opportunities in different contexts. And we also concluded in many of our researches that we need to have a Roma perspective in all the fields. And we also encourage authorities to include the Roma perspective, but even more generally to have a beneficial perspective in all the design, implementation, and evaluation of the programs, because we need to make the most of using the EU instruments.
Thank you. It is no coincidence that across Europe, people with disabilities, Roma children, Roma adults are dramatically overrepresented in institutions. So we also see here the structural funds as an amazing tool to challenge and fight discrimination, and as Zara was saying, to build the Europe we want without discrimination and with genuine equality for all. So, Yaman, thank you so much for that contribution. And now I'm moving on to Jana, and I'm sorry for getting the mix-up with the order.
No problem, Georgette, and thank you for inviting us to be here. I think it's a really important publication that you're coming out with here, and I really hope that we can use it for our collective efforts for advocacy. I'm going to be very short because I know the next panel is going to be very interesting, and then we want to have some debate. Just to say that, you know, as Eurochild, we're involved in a campaign together with Hope and Homes for Children, with SOS Children's Villages, with Visa Europe, with the International Foster Care Organisation called Opening Doors for Europe's Children. The main way that we're working is that we have 16 national coordinators who are national NGOs, as much as possible working in concert with other NGOs across the country. And they are really at the forefront of this advocacy work, and we're delighted that several of them, 6 of them, were able to contribute to this report, because I think what is really important is that we are able to gather the evidence, but also, as Zara said, very importantly, build the capacity of these kinds of organisations to understand the intricacies of what is a very technical process. And without NGOs having that capacity, then we let governments basically do what they want. And I guess my comments, leading on from what Gerard said, I mean, yes, this is very, very important. We've been very glad that it's been so central into the prioritisation of the structural funds. But this funding period, we have loads of lessons to learn. So first issue for us is the whole concept of the partnership principle, the code of conduct on partnership. Very, very important that it was in there, but its actual implementation is extraordinarily poor, I would say, in the way that member states have taken this whole area seriously. It seems to be mostly a tick-boxing exercise or a way of involving some friendly NGOs that they might get along with, that they know are not going to cause much trouble. But actually the countries that have really taken this seriously and empowered organisations to understand the system, to be monitoring on an ongoing basis, to be able to give critical feedback, is really very, very weak. So I think this is really something we need to look at in the next round of funding. How are we making that code of conduct on partnership actually work in practice? And I think we need to really put our heads together with the Commission. We're very keen that the Commission has a little bit more important role, and I know, that you're doing your utmost to coordinate and put pressure on governments, but the observation role in the monitoring committee could be stronger if you were actually a member of those monitoring committees, because I know that this is all a kind of bit of a tug of war amongst the member states and the Commission, but we really need to see that this is being taken seriously. So the more that we can work in concert with the Commission on this, the better. And then in the spending, and I completely agree with the findings of the report, this issue of trans-institutionalisation. So we have a new word, but it is happening, and that's what our members are saying, and that it's not seen as a step on the road. It's seen as the end goal, that you're basically building these wonderfully designed separate houses, away from the nice sort of environments, and the buildings are perfect. And so it's really not understood as a kind of comprehensive system of how we're reforming our services into more prevention, community support, family support. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in guiding and helping governments at all levels to understand what it is that we're trying to achieve. And as the MEP said in her opening, this is about public awareness. This is about telling the story of what we're actually trying to deliver so that you get that public support for the agenda that we're trying to push. Because people, I think, if they understood what it is and its complexity, they would be very supportive of it. So I will stop there so that we can move on to the next panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jana. Much appreciated. I think everybody will agree there was really powerful and important voices and key messages for us all to take away. I'd really like, without further ado, to move to have the next panel come up. And Neil, I wonder if you'll come and join us rather than there be some more moving around at the end. Does that sound like a good idea? So please, our next panellists, please come and join us. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Can you tell me if I'm going to hit something? Yeah. Okay. Go. Good. Enough.
So if you can set it with us, and then I'll just quickly hand over to you. And we might even get to a point where Okay, so without further ado, thank you everybody, and we have a new panel. We are really honoured to have Mr. Baudouin Badrou, who is the Member of Cabinet for Commissioner Tyson, obviously for Employment, Social Affairs, Skills and Labour Mobility. So, Mr. Badrou, please.
Thank you very much, Georgette, for inviting me here. I think what I have heard this morning and what is in the report, for which I congratulate you, basically not only on the content but also on the timing, is exactly what I'm doing every day, because I'm responsible in particular of the budget of the Employment and Social Affairs. So everything I've read is very familiar to me, but including certain issues that I will come back on in my short intervention. As you know, under the current programming period for, in particular, the European Social Funds, but the structural funds in more broader terms, we have already identified the deinstitutionalization as one of the actions we have to support very clearly. There are a number of provisions for that, but more largely, you know that for this period we have asked the member states to use at least 20% of the European Social Fund's budget for social inclusion. Actually, they have done much more than that, because we are now above 25%, which is very encouraging. It's not something that we impose from Brussels. It's something that in the member states is also recognized and acknowledged as a high priority, in particular after the crisis that we have now more or less behind us, but for which we have still to address the consequences, in particular in the increase in inequality between member states, also within member states, between regions. This priority given in the European Social Funds, together with other investment funds, is translated in many member states in concrete actions. There is one in particular in Italy where they have actually adopted a national stability law by which they create a fund aimed at supporting the National Plan Against Poverty with a budget of 600 million in 2016 and 1 billion in 2017. So we believe that, in particular with the European Social Funds and the funds for the most deprived persons, member states have actually today the tools and also the means, financially speaking, to address effectively the issue of social inclusion, including the need for the institutionalization. But what I wanted to stress particularly in my intervention is something that happened last Friday in Gothenburg, which is the first social summit since 20 years, which means that the Union is starting to shift from the focus on economy and fiscal discipline to more and more social. And I think you remember, the ones who are following the life in Europe and the Commission, in particular, that Jean-Claude Juncker announced in 2014 he wants to do everything to provide a social AAA to the European Union. And I think this is happening. The Commission decided at the beginning of this mandate to be big on big things and small on small things. So we will much more give respect to subsidiarity, let the member states do more, and we intervene only when there is an added value at EU level. We have so far presented 27 legislative proposals in the employment and social affairs. So we want to be big in social. I think that must be, again, repeated very forcefully. The first question we had when the social pillar has been presented in April this year and now proclaimed by the three institutions last Friday is how would you implement that? And maybe 2 words, the social pillar, what is it? Is a list of 20 principles and rights, in particular regarding social protection, equality, inclusiveness. There are three categories, equal opportunity and access to labour market, fair working conditions, and social protection and inclusion. I will not go into details, but there are a lot of things there that are actually addressing the issues we are dealing with today. Implementing of the pillar of social rights will be, first of all, done through the semester. The semester is a cyclus by which we observe what's happening in the member states in terms of performance of their policy. So far, it was very much about economic and budget policy. Now we are including also social policy. Concretely, there is a social scoreboard with 14 indicators that will be used from now in the semester. The semester becomes also a kind of social surveillance system about the performance of the member states. And we will, on that basis, also define what the member states have to invest on in priority and also monitor whether they are making progress or not. So it is something which is, I think, very concrete. We do not impose something on the member states, but we will make a lot of pressure. And at the end of the day, the member states adopt themselves that specific recommendation. So they are taking ownership of the priority where they have to invest. A last word on the next multi-annual financial framework. Actually, we want to continue this trend that this Commission started by putting the social at the center of the priorities. And our idea for the moment is to develop a specific window in the next financial framework dedicated to human capital development and social inclusion. Putting the different instruments together to create more leverage and also more flexibility to reply to unmet needs at the beginning of the period. The ex-ante conditionality 9.1 about obliging, let's say, the member states to have a fight against poverty strategy will be, of course, maintained and probably reinforced. And the last word, I think the partnership, the issue about partnership and participation of civil society is a real issue for us. There is a framework, there is this code of conduct indeed, and we know also that it's not implemented the same way and sometimes very poorly in certain member states. So we need you to bring to us information, evidence of what is working and what is not working and why, and how we can together define solutions to that for the next framework. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I do apologise for only giving you 5 minutes because I know that you would have so much to say to us, and we really do. We are honoured that you're here, and it's clearly that your Commissioner considers this of such importance. I'm going to move straight on to Martha from the Fundamental Rights Agency, and please, you have 5 minutes, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgette, and I'd like to start by congratulating everybody involved in the preparation of this report. The Fundamental Rights Agency is very proud to be an observer to the steering committee of the project because this is an issue of very high importance for our work. And I think particularly one of the really good aspects of this report is how cross-cutting it is and how many different groups it brings in. And it was really nice here to see a representative of the Roma community of Roma advocacy because I think there's a lot that we can learn from different groups. And I really hope also that this report is picked up and used by as many different groups and representatives of different groups as possible. There's a huge number of things in this report to unpick, but I just want to focus on a few that really chime very strongly with the findings of our new reports on deinstitutionalisation, of which there are some copies here, so please do pick them up. The first is about what is it that we're funding. And here, of course, we talk a lot about deinstitutionalization, but we're not just funding DI. We should also, of course, be funding the build-up of services in the community, and to make sure not just that specialized services are in place to enable people to live in the community, but also that the services that everybody uses are genuinely available to everybody. And there, one, of course, of the key things to remember is really the broad range of different activities that can be supported by the structural funds, and that we really take advantage of the full extent of the possibilities that are available to us. So, for example, one of the things we looked at in our research is that in Latvia, there's guidelines on the development of social services for the current funding period. And that includes a range of different activities, for example, developing individual support plans, funding housing adaptations and other infrastructure, technical oversight of the implementation of deinstitutionalization plans, and research on the efficiency and sustainability of social services. So there's really a huge range of different activities that the ESIF can support. The second point is about ensuring a joined-up approach to the use of ESIF and the implementation of deinstitutionalization. And that's both at a vertical level, so between different levels of government, and that's something that's really emerged very strongly from our research, is the challenges of ensuring that there is effective coordination between the national level, the regional level, the local level. Deinstitutionalization and independent living is something that happens in local communities. And so if efforts to that end don't reach the local level, it's not going to be achieved. But of course, it's also horizontal coordination. And we see too often that the efforts towards DI continue to happen in silos. And there's not sufficient coordination between health services, social services, education, employment, housing. And to really build up those links is extremely important. Thirdly, enhancing monitoring. We've heard a lot about the involvement of civil society organizations in monitoring, and certainly that is something that is extremely important. But from the Fundamental Rights Agency perspective, we also see that there's a gap in terms of the engagement of national human rights bodies. So whether that be national human rights institutions, equality bodies, ombuds organizations, and that there's a lot more potential for those organizations to be involved in ESIF monitoring at the national level. And for that to be effective, of course, we need transparency, we need availability of information to enable that monitoring to be effective. Fourthly is using this knowledge beyond ESIF. Because as Gerard has already pointed out, of course, ESIF should be additional funding to support processes underway at the national level. Even if we know in practice it's not always quite that simple. But we know that national funds are used for institutions still in many, many countries. And therefore, I think we can try to use a lot of the information coming out of this report, coming out of other reports, to be able to also think about how we can shift funding at the national level to support community living and independent living. And this, of course, is also going to be crucial in terms of ensuring sustainability, because there's always a risk when you have project-based funding that it stops when the project ends. So my last point is really that this report serves to underline that there's a huge depth of expertise in this area. And really now the challenge that faces all of us is how can we use this knowledge most effectively, and how can we make sure that it reaches the right people who are really going to be able to make the changes in practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha, so much. And I am going to keep us over for 10 minutes and hope that we don't get kicked out. Without further ado, because this is last but absolutely not least, I would like to hand over to Christoph Kasperik from DG Regio. Please.
Thank you to all the organizers, and thank you for inviting me. I am not the best specialist, the only specialist in the region on this subject. There are my colleagues here, so they can complement what I say here. I am a simplification guy. So I am a guy from the unit which is responsible for the ex-ante conditionalities, and which this unit and region as a whole really believes that they work. And they show how European funds can be used as a leverage, and this particular ex-ante conditionalities, not just the one on 9.1. It's just one. Probably even more important one is the horizontal one, which applies to all the funds, and where we have a strong position line, which was recently reinforced, that we don't want leaking. So, for instance, if this technically is not about community care, then we can do it. For example, with energy efficiency and so on. So we have a strong policy line that this applies horizontally. This is an obligation of the member states to do it. Also outside of 9.1. So from this point of view, these conditionalities work. They provide strong leverage, which is much more difficult to ensure if we just rely on the European semester measures. Yeah. European semesters, there is a real resistance in quite a lot of places to change. We need to change it. We need to change culture. We need to change certain practices. We have people working in the institutions who defend their jobs and so on. So we have real life on the ground is the way it is. So you need not just, there will be a natural tendency to a lot of institutions to postpone, to not to do anything, just to continue the conservative status quo. And the European funds are best used when you can leverage them to make an institutional structural change. And you can do it, and this particular measure, exactly because it's connected to national authorities, because it requires, the European Union hasn't taken over the design of projects. We force the national and regional and local authorities to change their mindsets. This is what is important. So I don't think some of the speakers said that they are under impression that we are somehow, that there is a likelihood that the ex-ante conditionalities would disappear in the next period. I don't think, I've never heard that they might disappear. We want to make them working. Yes, so we would like to streamline them, focus them, but those who do work should stay and should be reinforced and should be meaningful in a proper way. And I don't think anybody questions the need for this particular horizontal one, not just the one related to 9.1. So, as I said, there are ex-ante conditionalities. They are unlikely to be challenged in the future. We are working now on how to phrase them better, how to make them part of the normal delivery system in an efficient way. Of course, there are countries which resist. We try to put pressure on them. We not just put pressure, we connect the funding to this, so it's not just talking. But part of the reason why, and this will be second point, why it's sometimes difficult to enforce, that quite a lot of what we do in the cohesion policy and generally in the European structural investment funds, there's a lot of also unnecessary requirements. So this gets buried in the monitoring committee. Simply there is no time to discuss it because we have hundreds of other issues which are of less importance and not necessarily related to what we are doing. So what we need to do is actually streamline the system and focus to give more visibility, to give more time, to give more possibilities to discuss what is being discussed. So what you have interest in is, I don't think for example, there are some ideas that you should have a new ex-ante conditionalities on code of conduct of partnership. This wouldn't work. And so in practice, if there's no ownership, if there's no time, we can write in the regulation that you should listen more to the social partners, but you cannot legislate this kind of things. Yes, so from this point of view, what we need to make sure that there is a bigger transparency, and very often the transparency is achieved by just cutting the bullshit. Yes, so having more things, just few things to be discussed. So in my unit, my job, and I was also responsible for high-level group on simplification, this was my task, also to help those rules which should stay and which will stay to be really easier to monitor for you. This is again, I would not manage to do it within 1 minute, but I will try to be very fast. So what we said, so on this temporary solutions, we agree with you 100%. So he says this is the policy line of the DG as well. One thing which I wanted to mention and also related to simplification, which I think is also important from your point of view. Part of the reasons why authorities are resisting is because for a normal NGO or for a normal small institution or small group or for a family, applying for the funds is simply very difficult. So he says there is an indirect discrimination of anybody who doesn't have the capacity to read all the hundreds of pages of guidelines. So he says there is a natural, because of complexity of our rules, we do have a tendency to support the big ones because you just get a bigger invoice and that's simply easier. So this is not because people they don't have a preference whom to support or not. They just go for the easy thing which would spend it faster, which gives more, it's simply easier to deal with a bigger organization. So he says what we need to do for the next, and where we need your support, that you go, once we propose the rules, that you go through the rules and see them from the point of view of those who should get the money, also from the point of view of capacity to understand and simplicity of the rules. And fourth point, and this is the last one, we actually do support those of you who said that we need integrated approach. So it says we cannot multiply hundreds of windows in which you would get money for this particular aspect, for the other particular aspects separately. Because again, for those who really need this to be done, first of all, in the context of what we are talking about today, we need to change the environment. So you cannot just it's not just about supporting the family directly, it's about making sure that every single investment done around takes that into account and takes it seriously. So what we need effective mechanisms that even if we have social window, if we have specific funds, we will not make it more difficult for people to access it, and we will not just say this is for those on 9.1. One more thing. Again,
kicked out of the room.
Okay, we will not. One more thing is on the role of the Commission in the monitoring committee, because I think it's also relatively important. We are discussing it, so we are thinking about it. But the worst thing you can want from us is that the Commission would validate something which is not good. Yeah? So, instance, you don't want. We will also have our capacity constraints in terms of what we can deliver, what we cannot. So we are open to discuss how to get involved more, how to be more active. But you also don't want the Commission saying, yes, validate, we validate. We are thinking about how to be involved in the monitoring committee and validating of the selection criteria. But we have to discuss with you how to do it so it's not abused in any way.
Thank you so much, and I am sorry to cut you off. Thank you. We are getting kicked out of the room, and Mairead McGuinness, our Member of Parliament, has suggested that she can address us outside. So if everybody doesn't mind being an informal group outside, let's quickly rush out there. We can also do a bit of Q&A if people can stay around for 5 minutes or so. Thank you.
The revolution starts here.